motorcycle engines roared to a halt, a sudden silence that was louder than the noise. "This place pays protection or this place burns." The biker leader's voice cut through the quiet, his massive hand wrapping around the collar of the woman, wiping down the bar. The jagged scar on his face seemed to tighten as he pulled her closer, his breath reeking of old cigarettes and menace. "I asked you a simple question, sweetheart. Which one's it going to be?" Anya kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her body language screaming submission, even as 10 members of the Road Dogs Motorcycle Club rose from their seats, forming a predatory circle around her. She was maybe 5 feet 7 inches in her worn sneakers, her faded red polo shirt hanging loose on her slight frame. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun that made her look even younger than her 35 years. Everything about her whispered, ordinary, forgettable, weak. But in exactly 15 minutes, the biker leader would be on his knees, begging for forgiveness. Before we dive in, if you like this kind of stories of overcoming adversity and justice, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. There are shadows that fall on the quietest of places. Here, on a dusty stretch of forgotten highway, a storm was gathering, its thunder not of nature, but of steel and leather. It was a place called The Last Stop, a small diner and bar that had seen better days, but still held on, like an old man refusing to move from his porch. The sun beat down on its peeling paint, and the only sound was the gentle chime of the wind through an old bell above the door. A lone pickup truck sat in the gravel lot, its windows down, the radio softly playing a classic country song. The stillness was a kind of prayer, a fragile peace that was about to be shattered. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the air. A low rumble at first, a distant tremor that vibrated through the ground. It grew louder, a deep growl that promised trouble. Soon, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, swirling like a desert tornado. It was not a storm, but a pack of motorcycles, their engines roaring, their chrome glinting under the harsh sun. They were a sight that brought a nervous silence to any town they passed through, a reputation that preceded them. Folks around these parts called them the Road Dogs, and their name was whispered in hushed tones, a warning to anyone who ran a business. They were known for leaving a trail of broken windows and empty cash registers in their wake, and The Last Stop was next on their list. The owner of the old gas station across the street, an old man named Jed, watched from his worn-out stool, his eyes squinted against the glare. He knew their kind. He'd seen them pass through, a pack of circling sharks looking for a weak spot, a place to take what wasn't theirs. Just last month, they'd hit a place 3 towns over, a family-owned grocery store. They'd walked in, acted like they owned the place, and left a mess of shattered glass and a stolen safe. They were predators, pure and simple, and they were headed straight for the last remaining sanctuary on this desolate road. The bikes pulled off the main highway, their tires crunching on the gravel, kicking up a thick plume of white dust that hung in the air. One by one, they killed their engines, the sudden silence heavier than the noise. The pack dismounted, their movements synchronized, a practiced dance of intimidation. They moved not like a disorganized mob, but like a unit, spreading out to flank the entrance, a silent, disciplined threat. The leader of the pack, a large man with a thick beard and an air of quiet menace, took a long drag from his cigarette. He tossed it to the ground, crushed it under the heel of his heavy boot, and started walking towards the door. The moment stretched, a long, tense pause before the first act of the play. The bell above the door gave a final, desperate jingle, and then the door opened, letting the darkness of the bar spill out into the daylight. He entered, and the light from the door cast a long, dancing shadow on the dusty floorboards. The bell above the door gave a final, desperate jingle, and the sound hung in the air, a warning that no one seemed to heed. Inside, the world was quiet. The air was thick with the scent of stale beer, old wood, and the faint, clean smell of bleach. A woman in a simple, faded red polo shirt and worn jeans moved behind the long, polished mahogany bar. Her name was Anya, and at 35, she carried herself with a quiet grace, her movements fluid and efficient. Her dark hair was tied back in a neat bun, and her hands moved without a wasted motion, polishing a glass until it gleamed. She was a picture of serene focus, an eye in the very center of the gathering hurricane. Behind her, a young man named Jake, barely 20, was hunched over, his hands trembling as he stacked clean glasses on a shelf. His eyes were wide with fear, darting from the door to Anya, his body a coiled spring of anxiety. He had heard the stories, and now he was seeing them walk right into his safe space. He didn't understand how Anya could be so calm, how she could continue to polish a glass as if nothing in the world had changed. "Anya," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Anya, they're here. The road dogs." Anya didn't stop her work. She didn't look up. Her hands moved in a steady, rhythmic motion, the cloth whispering against the glass. Her response was a simple, quiet sound, a soft hum. She didn't have to say anything. Her presence alone was a contradiction to the fear that filled the room. Jake, however, wasn't reassured. His eyes pleaded with her to do something, to show some kind of reaction, to feel the same terror he was feeling. "We have to lock the doors. Call the sheriff. Do something," he hissed, his voice a frantic plea. Anya finally stopped her polishing. She held the clean glass up to the light, inspecting it for any smudges, as if this simple act was the most important thing in the world. She then placed it on the rack and moved on to the next. Her gaze remained calm, her posture still. "We're not locking the doors, Jake. Not for anyone." Her voice was low and even, a quiet tone that carried no panic, no fear. She simply moved her hands to the next glass, her focus unwavering. Jake watched her, a mixture of awe and confusion on his face. He saw her as fragile, a simple server in a dangerous world, and her composure was a mystery he couldn't comprehend. She finally looked up, her gaze steady, not at Jake, but towards the door where the leader of the bikers had just crossed the threshold. The calm in her eyes was a deep, silent ocean. The biker leader stepped fully inside, his presence a physical force that seemed to absorb the dim light. He was a mountain of a man, his form defined by thick leather and bulging muscles. His face, partially hidden by a dark beard, was dominated by a jagged scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his jaw, a white mark against his sun-beaten skin. His arms were a canvas of faded ink, swirling patterns that told stories of forgotten battles. He didn't walk so much as he stalked, his heavy boots silent on the old wood, the other bikers fanning out behind him. They moved with a purpose, each man taking up a position near a table, a corner, or an exit, their movements practiced and controlled. They weren't just a group of men, they were a tactical formation. Anya saw it immediately. Her mind, like a silent computer, processed the information in a fraction of a second. The way they spaced themselves, the way one of them instinctively moved to block the emergency exit, the way another leaned against the jukebox, his posture relaxed but his eyes scanning the room for threats. This wasn't random hooliganism. This was a shakedown. This was a team that had done this before, maybe dozens of times. It was the kind of silent language she hadn't heard in years, a language of violence and control. She saw the fear on the faces of the patrons, the subtle flinching, the way they tried to shrink into their seats. Jake's eyes were wide with panic, and he was gripping the bar so hard his knuckles were white. The leader of the road dogs, the man with the scar, surveyed the room, his gaze resting on each patron for a moment before moving on. His eyes were cold, like chips of gray granite. His followers, a collection of hardened faces and leather jackets, stood as silent sentinels, making it clear that no one was to move without permission. The air was thick with their unspoken threat, and the quiet was absolute. The leader's eyes finally landed on Anya. He saw her composure, her simple red shirt and jeans, her steady gaze, and a flicker of something, perhaps curiosity or challenge, passed over his face. He took a few more steps forward, stopping at the end of the bar. He leaned against it, his size dwarfing the small space. He flashed a cold, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. His voice, when it came, was a low growl, falsely friendly but edged with a razor of menace. "Evening, folks. Hope you don't mind us crashing your little get-together. Just a few thirsty travelers looking for a place to rest our bones." He raised his hand in a mocking salute, but his eyes never left Anya's. It was a command, not a greeting. He was letting them all know that he was in charge now. And with that, he took a step back, the game beginning. Anya moved with quiet purpose, a small, worn notepad in her hand. She approached the leader and his men, her expression neutral, her eyes scanning their faces, taking them all in without seeming to. She stopped in front of the leader, her pen poised over the paper. "What can I get for you, gentlemen?" Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, yet it carried clearly in the suddenly silent room. The leader, a man named Hammer, to his crew, a name earned for his brutal efficiency, smirked. His eyes, cold and calculating, raked over Anya, from her neatly pulled back hair to her worn jeans, lingering for a moment on the simple red polo shirt. One of his men, a burly figure with a grim tattoo snaking up his neck, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Anya's chest. "How about a smile, sweetheart?" he slurred, reaching out a hand, his fingers aiming for the fabric of her shirt, just above her breast. His movement was slow, deliberate, a clear act of disrespect, a test. Anya didn't flinch. Her hand, holding the notepad, moved with an almost imperceptible flick, a whisper of motion. The man's hand, instead of connecting with her shirt, brushed harmlessly against the air, just inches from her. It looked like an accident, a clumsy miss on his part, but Jake, watching from behind the bar, saw the subtle shift of her weight, the precise tilt of her body. It was a dance of avoidance, fluid and practiced, a movement that spoke of deep-seated instinct rather than conscious thought. The biker stumbled slightly, his smirk faltering for a moment, confusion clouding his eyes. Jake, despite his fear, felt a surge of anger. He took a step forward, his jaw clenched, ready to shout, to defend Anya. "Hey, watch it, buddy," he began, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and terror. But before he could finish, Anya's gaze, calm and steady, met his. It was a silent command, a fractional shake of her head that Jake understood immediately. "Stand down." "Not yet." He swallowed his protest, his hands clenching into useless fists at his sides. Anya turned back to Hammer, her face still impassive. "Anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice even, as if the attempted assault had never happened. Hammer's eyes narrowed, a slow smile spreading across his face. He watched Anya with a new, calculating interest, a predator who had just spotted prey that was unexpectedly nimble. This was not the timid mouse he was used to. This woman was different, and that made her more interesting, more of a challenge to break. He knew, then, that this wouldn't be as easy as he had hoped. He settled back, his gaze fixed on her, the hunt beginning in earnest. Hammer, leaning on the bar with a false casualness, let his gaze drift from Anya to Jake and back again. The silence was heavy with a power play that only the three of them could feel. "I heard this place was having some trouble," Hammer began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Broken windows. Tires slashed. Funny thing, seems to happen a lot in this part of the country to places that don't have protection." He said the last word with a twist of his lips, as if it were a joke. Anya, meanwhile, was wiping down a part of the bar that was already spotless. She didn't look up, her hands moving in small, controlled circles. "The owner's away," Anya replied calmly, her voice a stark contrast to the menace in his. "I'm just watching the place." Hammer's cold eyes glittered with amusement. "Well, that's a shame, because I'm offering a service. A security service. Just a small fee. Keeps the undesirables away." He pulled a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his jacket pocket and tapped one out. His eyes, however, were on a small, framed photo behind the bar, a smiling older couple. The owner's parents, Anya knew. It was a subtle threat, a flicker of his lighter near the wood paneling. The unspoken message was clear: refusal would have consequences. Jake, who had been listening with rising dread, clenched his fists. He knew this game. He'd seen it in the movies, heard about it on the news. They were asking for money, and if they didn't get it, the place would be unprotected and suffer an accident. He saw Anya's continued silence as a sign of her naivete, her failure to grasp the gravity of the situation. He wanted to scream, to tell her to just give them the money. But Anya, with her quiet strength, simply moved to the other side of the bar, her cleaning rag still in hand. "I don't have the authority to make that decision," she stated, her words measured and polite. "And even if I did, this is a family place. We don't have money for protection." Her refusal wasn't an act of defiance, but a simple statement of fact. It was a perfectly civil deflection that infuriated Hammer more than any angry outburst could have. He slammed his hand on the bar, the sound echoing through the suddenly tense room. "Lady, you're not listening," he growled, the pretense of civility gone. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you what's going to happen." You have a choice. You can be smart, or you can be stupid. The quiet of the bar was gone, replaced by the weight of a clear and present threat. Hammer, a storm cloud of fury and impatience, gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Instantly, his followers moved. It was a well-practiced routine, a silent, coordinated ballet of intimidation. They spread out, not in a disorganized mob, but in a precise, tactical formation that Anya recognized instinctively. One man moved to block the main entrance, his massive frame filling the doorway. Another casually leaned against the jukebox, his eyes scanning the room as if checking for threats, but in reality, he was cutting off an escape route. The others formed a loose, semicircle around Anya, their forms casting long, menacing shadows. Anya's mind, a quiet engine of analysis, immediately began to run a threat assessment. This was a classic military tactic, a soft encirclement. It was designed to psychologically pressure the target, to make them feel trapped with no way out. Her mind cataloged each man's position, his posture, his subtle weaknesses. The one blocking the door was favoring his left leg, an old injury perhaps, which meant he would be slower to react. The one by the jukebox was distracted, his gaze shifting from the room to the windows outside. Anya, with a quiet calm that belied the rising tension, was already mentally planning her countermoves, her escape routes, her points of engagement. This was a dance she knew all too well, one she had hoped she would never have to perform again. In the midst of this controlled chaos, her fingers, still gripping the cleaning rag, brushed against a small, flat object tucked into her jeans pocket. It was a simple, worn metal rectangle, smooth from years of being carried. It was her dog tag, a small, tangible piece of a past she had worked so hard to bury. The brief, cool touch of the metal was a grounding force, a silent reminder of who she was, a soldier's anchor in a sea of civilian life. It brought with it a flood of memories, the roar of engines, but of a different kind, a helicopter's rotor blades, the taste of dust, but from a different desert, the sense of dread, but from a much greater enemy. Hammer took a step, a slow, deliberate movement that closed the space between them. He was now so close that Anya could feel the heat radiating from him, the scent of leather and stale cigarettes heavy in the air. He had violated her reactionary gap, the crucial personal space a soldier maintains to be able to react to a threat. This was the final step of the intimidation, the point of no return. It was a clear signal that he was no longer talking. Now he was acting. The next move, a physical one, was inevitable, and Anya knew it. She met his cold eyes with a gaze that held a depth he could not possibly comprehend, a deep stillness that lay beneath the surface of a warrior. The silence was suddenly broken by a gruff voice from the back of the room. "That's enough," it commanded. A man in his late 60s, a retired sheriff named Bradley, stood up from his booth. He had a weathered face and a quiet authority that still clung to him despite his years out of the uniform. He placed a hand on the shoulder of the patron next to him, who had started to rise, and gave him a calm, reassuring look. Bradley then stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Hammer. "You boys need to leave," he said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't your town." Hammer turned, a sneer twisting his lips. He sized up the older man, his eyes dismissive. "I don't see a badge, Grandpa. You're out of your league." His followers chuckled, a low, menacing sound that echoed through the bar. They shifted their weight, their eyes now on Bradley, ready for the next command. They saw an old man, not a former lawman, and they underestimated him completely. Bradley didn't flinch. "It's not about a badge," he said, his gaze unwavering. "It's about a line you just crossed. And you don't want to know what happens when a community like this decides to stand together." His words, simple and direct, had an effect. The other patrons in the room, emboldened by his stand, began to subtly stir. A few men stood up, their hands hanging loosely at their sides, their bodies tensed and ready. There was a farmer, a mechanic, and a couple of other veterans from the nearby VFW hall. They were outmatched in numbers, but their presence added a quiet weight to Bradley's words. Hammer's smirk widened into a full-blown grin. "Look at you," he scoffed, gesturing around the room with a theatrical sweep of his hand. "A bunch of old men trying to be heroes. This is a business matter, and you're not a part of it." He looked back at Anya, his gaze cold and full of contempt. "This is between me and her." "Anya," who had been listening in silence, now spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a sigh, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "It's all right, Bradley," she said, her eyes meeting the sheriff's. "They were just leaving." She said it with such finality and calm that it was as if she had already won, as if the entire confrontation had already ended. Bradley looked at her, saw the quiet resolve in her eyes, and slowly, reluctantly, took a step back, allowing the focus to shift back to Anya. Hammer, enraged by her attempt to control the situation, closed the final gap between them, the last vestiges of his patience gone. He saw her as a puppet and himself as the puppet master. He was about to make his final, fatal mistake. Leaving. Hammer's voice was a low snarl, a sound of pure contempt. His eyes, fixed on Anya, were cold and hard. "We're not going anywhere until we're done here." He reached out, his big hand closing around the collar of her faded red polo shirt. His grip was a vice, a painful, brutal assertion of his power. He yanked hard, a vicious tug that was meant to humiliate, to show everyone in the room that she was nothing more than a plaything. Anya's body was a study in stillness, a rock against a crashing wave. She didn't fight him, didn't struggle. She simply stood her ground, her gaze fixed on his, a silent challenge that enraged him even more. The air went still. Every person in that room. Jake behind the bar, the patrons huddled in their booths, Sheriff Bradley watching with a grin set to his jaw, held their breath. They were all waiting for her to break, to scream, to fall. They saw her as a victim, a small woman against a brute of a man, and they braced themselves for the inevitable. The sound that followed was not a scream or a cry of pain. It was the sharp, tearing sound of old cotton. The fabric of her shirt gave way under the strain, ripping from her collarbone down to the center of her chest, a jagged, violent tear that exposed the skin beneath. The sound was a single, devastating note of finality, and it froze the entire bar. It was a sound of violation, a sound that should have been accompanied by a cry of protest. But there was only silence. Anya stumbled back a single step, the ruined shirt hanging uselessly from her shoulders. Her face remained impassive, betraying no fear, no anger, no shame. The tear in the fabric had revealed a small, dark shape on her chest, a glimpse of something etched into her skin. Hammer's smirk vanished. His jaw went slack. The sound of the fabric ripping was supposed to be a triumph, a final act of dominance. But the silence that followed was a defeat. He stared, not at her face, but at the dark symbol on her skin. His eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief and then a dawning comprehension of terror. He wasn't the only one. A low gasp came from the back of the room. The patrons, the old men, the young bartender, they all saw it, too. A flash of ink. Not a gang tattoo, not a tribal design. Something else. Something that meant something entirely different. The silence grew, and in that silence, a new kind of fear settled over the room. It was not the fear of the predator, but the fear of a hunter who has stumbled upon a beast far greater than he could have ever imagined. The game was over. The rules had just changed. The predator had become the prey. Hammer stood frozen, his hands still suspended in the air, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the woman in front of him. The patrons, the old men and women who had watched in helpless silence, were now staring with a collective sense of awe and dawning comprehension. The torn red fabric of Anya's shirt hung from her shoulders, a shredded remnant of her civilian life. Exposed on her left shoulder, just below her clavicle, was the symbol that had brought the world to a halt. It wasn't a tattoo, it was a brand. The ink was a faded black, but the image was stark and clear. It was the seal trident. An eagle clutching a trident and a flintlock pistol, all superimposed on an anchor. The symbols were simple but powerful. The eagle, representing the American spirit. The trident, a sign of her mastery of the seas. The pistol, for the land. The anchor, a foundation of honor. This was not a fashion statement. It was a mark of belonging to a very small, very deadly fraternity. A mark earned through blood and unimaginable hardship. But that wasn't all. Just below the trident, and extending across her collarbone, were a series of faded, thin white lines. They weren't scars from a kitchen accident or a childhood fall. They were the telltale tracks of shrapnel. A small, dark indentation just above her heart was a healed bullet wound. These were not the blemishes of a hard life. They were the battle marks of a survivor. The canvas of her skin told a story that her quiet demeanor had tried so hard to hide. A story of fire, of close calls, of brutal, life-or-death combat. Sheriff Bradley, a man who had seen combat himself a lifetime ago, breathed out a single word, his voice a hoarse whisper that carried through the stunned quiet. A seal. The word hung in the air, a bell tolling the end of one story and the beginning of another. It was a name, a rank, a title that made sense of everything. Her quietness, her stillness, her ability to deflect a threat with a mere shift of her body. The silent analysis of a tactical situation. The calm in her eyes, a kind of deep-set peace that only came from having faced the worst the world had to offer and having survived it. The entire room now saw her not as a waitress, but as a warrior who had walked among them, unrecognized and unassuming, a ghost of her former self. The tables had turned completely. The power had shifted. The game was over, and Hammer hadn't even known he had been playing for his life. Anya's shoulders, which had been slightly stooped as she moved through the bar, now straightened. The subtle curve in her back was gone, replaced by a ramrod-straight posture, the kind of bearing that spoke of rigorous training and a lifetime of discipline. Her chin came up, no longer in a gesture of defiance, but of simple, unshakable dignity. Her hands, which had been clutching the cleaning rag, fell to her sides, the movement deliberate and final. The soft, gentle eyes that had a moment ago held a deep, quiet calm were now gone. They were replaced by something else entirely. Eyes of steel, cold and direct, like a sniper's scope locking onto a target. The kind of eyes that had seen things no one in that room could ever imagine. The change in her was not loud or dramatic. It was a silent transformation. The bartender, Jake, watched in stunned disbelief. This was not the same woman he had worked with for 2 years. This was someone new, someone he had never known. She took a single, deliberate step forward, the movement as precise as a metronome. She looked at Hammer, who was still staring at the trident on her shoulder, his face a mask of dawning fear. Her voice, when it came, was no longer the soft, unassuming murmur of a server. It was low, clear, and utterly without emotion. It was a voice of command, a voice used to giving orders and having them followed without question. "Michael," she said, her voice cutting through the thick silence. Hammer flinched, his head snapping up. The name was a shock, a sudden crack in his armor. "They call you Hammer out here," she continued, her voice flat and even. "But your name is Michael. You grew up on a farm near here. Your brother used to run with a motorcycle club, but they kicked him out. You started your own to get revenge." She was not guessing. She was stating facts, facts she shouldn't have known. The quiet woman had already done her homework. Hammer's face was no longer just afraid. It was full of pure, abject terror. He had seen predators before, but he had never been the prey. He was a bully, a brute, but he was facing a different order of being. Anya took another step closer, closing the distance between them. Her voice dropped to a level that was a quiet threat, a chilling promise. "I believe you owe me an apology for my property." It wasn't a question. It was a command. A simple statement that completely and utterly stripped him of his power, reducing his act of brutal aggression to a petty act of vandalism. He stood frozen, a statue of a man who was about to be broken. Michael, the name hung in the air, a final nail in the coffin of his authority. The simple command, "I believe you owe me an apology for my property," had completely unmoored him. He was a man of violence and intimidation, and this quiet woman had just dismantled him with a few simple words and a quiet reveal. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His mind, accustomed to brute force, couldn't process this new reality. From a booth in the corner, a man in his late 60s named Arthur stood up slowly. He wore a crisp, light blue polo shirt and a pair of neatly pressed slacks. He was a man of quiet authority, his posture straight, his eyes holding a depth of wisdom and sorrow. Arthur was a retired colonel from the Army's Special Forces, a man who had served for decades in the shadows. He had been a silent witness to the entire scene, but now he had to speak. He looked at the trident on Anya's shoulder, then at her face. "That tattoo," he began, his voice a low rumble. "I've seen it before." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. 2009, the Helmand Province. A place called the Valley of Ghosts. He looked at Anya, his eyes filled with a respectful sadness. They called it that because no one ever came back. A convoy was ambushed, and the enemy was entrenched. The unit was pinned down. Out of nowhere, a single operative, a woman, went in. She took out a sniper team on a ridge, cleared a path, and held the line until reinforcements arrived. Saved a dozen men, including 2 of my own. Arthur's gaze was direct. They said she was a myth, a phantom, but the story was a legend in every command post. They said she did it with a broken wrist and a collapsed lung. Her call sign was Valkyrie. A second man, an old veteran with a cane, stood up. He had seen the scars on Anya's chest. She was medevaced. We thought she was gone. My team, we were the ones who patched her up. We told her she wouldn't make it. The bleeding was too bad. But she just stared at me, eyes cold as ice, and told me to finish the job. Said she had a dozen men waiting for her. He shook his head, a look of profound respect on his face. She wasn't human. She was a ghost. Anya, who had been listening with her head slightly bowed, finally spoke. They weren't ghosts, she said, her voice soft. They were just good men who couldn't come home. She looked at Arthur, a flicker of something in her eyes. You were right, Colonel. They were all just trying to get home. Her words, a quiet deflection of the praise, made the legend even more powerful. Hammer's knees began to tremble. He was trapped. There was no escape. The game was over. He was no longer a big fish in a small pond. He was a minnow in an ocean of sharks. Hammer's face was a study in pure terror, and his followers, seeing the shift in their leader, began to subtly break formation. The tactical unity they had displayed upon arrival was gone, replaced by a panicked, every man for himself instinct. They took a hesitant step back, then another, their eyes darting towards the door. They wanted out. The bar, which had been a hunting ground moments ago, had become a cage. They turned, a broken line of men desperate for escape, and moved towards the exit. But the exit was no longer clear. The patrons who had previously been hiding, shrinking into the corners, now stood tall. Sheriff Bradley was there, his arms crossed, a grim satisfaction on his face. Next to him was Arthur, the retired colonel, his posture straight and unyielding. The old veteran with the cane was there too, leaning against the door frame, a look of quiet resolve on his face. It was not a violent blockade, but it was an unbreakable one. These were not just townspeople. They were a community, and in that community were soldiers, veterans, and good men who had been waiting for a reason to fight. One of Hammer's men, a young one with a thin mustache, reached the door first. He pushed against the veteran with the cane, expecting him to give way. The old man didn't move an inch. He simply looked at the biker with eyes that had seen 1,000 battles. The biker's bravado crumpled. The man with the cane simply said, "Not so fast, son." Arthur, the retired colonel, took a step forward. He looked at the pack, now a pathetic, huddled group of bullies. His voice was low but carried the weight of his rank. "Gentlemen," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm. "You came in here as wolves. You're going to leave as dogs. Now, where do you think you're going?" Hammer, trapped between the door and the woman he had just humiliated, looked from face to face. The fear in their eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, collective fury. He was surrounded. The patrons of the bar, this small, unassuming community, had become a united front. He looked back at Anya, who was still standing with perfect stillness, the trident on her shoulder a symbol of a power he could not comprehend. Her eyes, cold as steel, looked right through him. He was a trapped animal, and he knew it. The only path forward was back to her, to face the quiet storm he had awakened. He had come to rob a place of its dignity, and in a single moment, he had lost all of his own. His face, once so arrogant and cruel, now twisted with a profound and utter sense of defeat. He was ready to beg. Anya took a slow, deliberate step forward, her worn boots making no sound on the dusty floorboards. Hammer, the man who had stalked in with such confidence, flinched. He instinctively took a step back, his body recoiling from her presence as if she were a physical force. The fear in his eyes was naked, a desperate plea for a mercy he had never shown to anyone. He was a predator who had just realized he was facing a lion. Anya stopped a few feet from him. Her voice, when it came, was cold and clear, a surgeon's tone. It was not filled with rage or emotion, but with a quiet, lethal precision. "You came in here," she began, her gaze unwavering, "and you used your size and your friends to intimidate a room full of good people. You threatened an honest business. You violated the dignity of this place and the folks who work here. You took what you thought was a simple act of aggression and turned it into an assault. She paused, letting each accusation hang in the air like a heavy stone. She took another step closer, and Hammer's head dropped slightly. I've faced enemies who used intimidation. They didn't do it for a few bucks. They did it to sow terror, to break a community's will to resist. She looked at him, her gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. And do you know what they are? They're cowards. They're bullies. Just like you. The word bully was a razor, cutting through his thick-skinned arrogance and exposing the pathetic truth of his existence. He was not a warrior. He was a common thug. He was nothing. Anya closed the final distance. She was so close that he could see the steely resolve in her eyes. Her voice dropped to a level that was barely a whisper, a command so cold and powerful that it echoed in the space between them. Michael, get on your knees. It was not a question. It was a command that came not from a physical threat, but from an authority he had never encountered. It was the absolute, unyielding voice of a superior officer. It was a command that went beyond logic and fear and spoke directly to the core of what he was, a man who had always bent his will to those stronger than him. He was a follower, and in this moment, she was his commander. Without a word, without a protest, Michael Hammer dropped to his knees, his head bowed in complete and utter submission. The crowd watched in stunned silence, a complete and total victory won without a single punch being thrown. Anya looked down at Michael, the once feared leader, now a pathetic figure on his knees. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and humiliation. The room remained completely silent, the patrons watching, their faces a mixture of satisfaction and awe. Anya's voice was low and clear, a steady tone that cut through the silence. She was not gloating, she was simply stating the new terms. This bar, she said, her voice carrying an unshakable finality, is under new management. This is not a place you will ever come back to. You understand? He nodded, a small, barely perceptible motion. This entire county, she continued, her gaze sweeping over the silent room and the people who now looked to her for protection, is off limits to you and your men. You will not threaten a single business. You will not shake down a single person. You will leave, and you will not return. Do you understand? He nodded again, a tear of shame rolling down his cheek and mixing with the dust on the floor. Good, she said, her voice softening slightly, but only with a cold purpose. Now, you owe me an apology, and you will give it to me, in front of everyone you threatened. She waited, her gaze unyielding. Tell them you are sorry, and mean it. Michael took a shaky breath. His voice, once a brutal growl, was now a broken whisper. I'm sorry, he mumbled, his head still bowed. I'm sorry for everything. I was wrong. He looked up at her for a moment, his eyes full of fear and a desperate plea. You're not sorry, she stated, her voice returning to its hard, clear tone. You're just afraid. But in my world, that is enough. I could end this right now, in 100 different ways, and no one here would be able to stop me. But that is not who I am anymore. You get to walk away today because I am showing you the mercy you would never have shown anyone else. The weight of her words was a physical force. She wasn't just talking about a bar. She was talking about a life, a choice, a path she had walked away from. She was a different kind of protector now. Now, she said, her voice firm, get up, get on your bikes, and get out of here. And don't ever look back. As he slowly rose to his feet, a flicker of something new, not arrogance, but a simple, human curiosity, entered his eyes. He looked at the trident on her shoulder, at the battle scars that surrounded it, and he asked a single, quiet question, the one that had been on everyone's mind since the shirt had ripped. Why, he whispered. Why did you hide who you were? The question was a final, humble plea for understanding, an admission that he had been completely out of his league. Because real warriors don't need to advertise their strength, she said. The job is the proof. The act is the advertisement. Not the patch, not the tattoo. She looked down at the trident on her shoulder, a symbol that had been a source of immense pride, but now felt like a heavy burden. We don't do it for the glory. We do it for the job. You do what you do for show. I did what I did for a life I believed in. She paused, letting the truth of her words sink in. The silence was absolute. I wanted a quiet life, she continued, her voice gaining a soft, sad note. A life where I could serve coffee instead of my country. Where I could pour a beer and not have to wonder if it was my last. A life where I was just Anya. And you, with all your noise and your show, you just took that away from me. She wasn't angry. She was simply stating a fact, a deep, bitter truth. He had stripped her of the one thing she truly wanted, anonymity. With a final, dismissive gesture of her hand, she said, "Now go." Michael rose slowly to his feet, his shoulders slumped, his entire body deflated. He turned and walked to the door, a completely different man than the one who had entered. His followers, who had been watching the scene in stunned silence, fell in behind him, their heads bowed, their movements slow and shuffling. They no longer moved as a tactical unit, but as a broken, defeated pack. The roar of their bikes, which had been a promise of violence upon their arrival, was now a quiet purr. They kicked their engines over one by one, the sound a low, ashamed rumble. There was no thunder, no bravado, just the quiet, sorrowful departure of a pack of humbled dogs disappearing down the dusty road. The only sound left was the distant hum of their engines fading into the night. Inside the last stop, a collective sigh of relief filled the air. Patrons slowly began to move, their bodies releasing the tension they had held for what felt like an eternity. Anya stood in the middle of the room, her shoulders still straight, the torn red fabric of her shirt a testament to the night's events. She looked out the window at the swirling dust kicked up by the departing bikes. A quiet, shared moment settled over the room, a collective breath held and then released. They had won, not with violence, but with truth. The patrons, once scattered and fearful, now stood in small groups, their conversations low and hushed. The air was filled with a sense of wonder and profound respect. From the back of the room, Sheriff Bradley, his shoulders no longer hunched with worry, approached Anya. He was a man who had seen many things, but a scene like this was new to him. "Anya," he said, his voice soft, almost a question. "Why?" He gestured with a subtle nod toward her shoulder. "With all that, why are you here? Pouring coffee and serving old men." Anya's shoulders, which had held the weight of the world, seemed to relax just a fraction. She looked at him, her gaze losing its steely edge and returning to something more like the quiet, gentle look he was used to. "I was tired, Sheriff," she said, her voice a low murmur. "I had seen too much. Too many ghosts. When you live that life, you become a monument to the past. The people back home, they don't see you. They see the flag on your shoulder. They see the medals in the box. They see the scars." She ran a hand over the trident on her shoulder. "I just wanted to be a person again." Jake, the young bartender, who had been listening from behind the bar, finally spoke. His voice was a shaky whisper. "I've been working with you for 2 years. You never said a word. You just poured coffee." He looked at her with a mix of awe and a faint sense of betrayal. He felt like he had been living with a secret he didn't even know existed. "We thought you were just a waitress." Anya smiled, a sad, knowing curve of her lips. "That was the point, Jake. I wanted to just be a waitress. To have a normal life. To do something simple and honest without having to carry all that with me." Her eyes, so recently full of a hunter's precision, now held a deep, profound weariness. "Every medal I ever earned is in a box in a closet. Every story is locked away. I came here to find peace. I thought I could outrun who I was." She looked around the now silent room. "But you can't." She shook her head, a slow, decisive motion. "But I don't regret what happened tonight," she said, her voice gaining a new strength. "They forced my hand. They made me remember who I was. And in doing so, they've shown me that I don't have to hide anymore. I don't have to be a ghost. I can be both. I can be a person who serves coffee, and I can be a woman who has earned the right to stand her ground. I can finally stop running from myself." The quiet acceptance of her dual identity settled over her, a newfound peace. She was no longer hiding. She was finally home. The quiet of the last stop was broken by the gentle scraping of a chair as a young man stood up from his booth. His name was Mark, a 24-year-old who wore a faded army jacket with a patch on the sleeve for the 101st Airborne. His eyes were haunted, and his hands, when he gripped his coffee mug, were unsteady. He had been a silent witness to the entire confrontation, and he saw in Anya not just a hero, but a reflection of his own internal struggle. He walked slowly, hesitantly, toward the bar where Anya was now calmly wiping down the counter. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a little hoarse. What you did, what you are. I've been home for a year now, and I just can't. He trailed off, unable to find the words. He was trying to say he couldn't adjust, that the world felt too quiet, too soft, after the brutal realities he had faced. He felt invisible, a ghost in his own life, and Anya's revelation had hit him with the force of a physical blow. Anya stopped wiping the counter and looked at him, her gaze now soft, filled with a deep, knowing empathy. It doesn't go away, she said quietly. The training, the instincts, the nightmares. It just changes. The mission changes. She gestured to the bar, to the worn wooden surface she had polished for years. This, she said, this can be a different kind of post. Attention to detail. Protecting others. Not with a rifle, but with a simple act. Making sure everyone who walks through that door feels safe. Seen. She refilled his coffee mug without him even asking, the steam rising between them, a silent bridge of understanding. You came back with a purpose. A set of skills. They don't have to be used on the battlefield. They can be used right here, in the quiet places, to create the peace you fought for. Her words were a balm, a simple truth he had been searching for. She articulated his new mission for him, a purpose he hadn't realized he had. She told him that his quiet life was not a sign of weakness, but a chance to rebuild, to create a new kind of sanctuary. I tried to find peace by running from who I am, she said, her voice a low and powerful confession. I now know that peace isn't found by hiding. It's found by creating it, by standing on the line, even in a quiet bar on a dusty road, and saying, this is a place of peace, and I will defend it. Her gaze met his, and he saw a new kind of determination in her eyes. My mission here is not just to serve coffee. It is to make this a haven, a place for people like us, a place where we can finally be understood. She placed the coffee mug in front of him. It was a simple act, but it felt like a sacred promise. A new mission, a new life, a new kind of service. She was still a server, but now she was a sentinel. The weeks that followed were a quiet, steady transformation. The last stop, once a dusty relic on a forgotten highway, began to change. Its peeling paint was still there, but now it felt like a badge of honor, a sign of its history. Inside, the bar took on a new life. The old country music on the jukebox was now often mixed with classic rock and the soulful ballads of a different era. The clientele, too, had shifted. While the regulars still came, their faces now mixed with a new, familiar kind of crowd, veterans. They were men and women of all ages, some in their 20s, others with gray hair, all of them looking for a place to feel understood. Anya, in her new role, was a quiet, steady presence. She knew their language. A simple look, a nod, or a few quiet words were all that was needed. She would pour them a beer or a coffee, and they would sit for hours, talking or simply existing in a place where they didn't have to explain themselves. The bar became a sanctuary. The community had seen the trident on her shoulder, and they responded not with questions, but with quiet respect. Physical changes began to appear on the walls. One day, a man in a Vietnam veteran cap came in and, with a shaky hand, pinned a small, faded photo of his platoon to the corkboard. Another day, an old Marine brought in a polished, framed copy of the Marine's hymn. The wall behind the bar, once a simple backdrop, became a tapestry of military history. Old patches, unit coins, and even a worn-out dog tag were hung with care, each one a silent story of service and sacrifice. The bar was no longer just a business. It was a museum, a living testament to the men and women who had protected their country. Then, the owner of the last stop, a man named Frank, returned. He was a kind-faced man in his late 70s who had been away visiting family. He had heard the stories, but he couldn't quite believe them until he saw the changes for himself. He found Anya cleaning a table, and he simply walked over, his eyes welling up with tears. "Anya," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just save my business. You gave it a soul." He made it clear that the bar was now hers to run, in whatever way she saw fit. She simply nodded, a look of profound gratitude on her face. The next week, she brought in a small box from her car. It was old and worn, and inside, on a bed of faded velvet, was a shiny, silver star, her country's third highest combat decoration. She had earned it for her valor in the Valley of Ghosts, the legendary battle that had brought her to this quiet place. She took a hammer and a nail, her hand steady, and she hung the metal on the wall, right beside the framed photo of a young man with a crooked smile. It was the first time she had looked at it in years. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was finally home, and she was building a home for others. The bar had been a sanctuary for weeks now, a quiet hum of conversation and camaraderie replacing the silence and fear. One evening, after the last of the veterans had left, Jake, the young bartender, stayed behind. He was wiping down the counter with a new, quiet determination, his face serious. He walked over to Anya, who was closing out the register. "Anya," he began, his voice low and earnest. "I've been thinking." She looked up at him, her gaze gentle. She had watched him change over the past weeks, from a nervous boy to a young man with a new sense of purpose. "What is it, Jake?" she asked. He took a deep breath. "I'm thinking of enlisting," he said. The words hung in the air between them, a profound ripple effect of the night the bikers came. "I've been talking to a recruiter. The Marines. I saw what you did. How you carried yourself. I want to be that. I want to be someone who can stand for something. Someone who's not afraid." He looked at her, his eyes full of a hero worship she hadn't wanted. Anya's face remained calm, but her eyes held a flicker of solemn sadness. She put her hand on his shoulder. "Jake," she said softly, "the life I had, it's not a video game. It's not a movie. It's hard. There's a price for what we do. You will see things and do things that will change you forever. The man who goes in, he never comes out the same." She was not trying to scare him. She was simply stating the truth, the creed of a warrior. You might come back to a world that doesn't understand you, and you might have to build a place like this all over again, just to feel okay. She looked at him with a direct, honest gaze. "Don't do it because of me. Don't chase a ghost. Do it because you believe in the uniform. Do it because it's what you need to be, not because of a legend." Her advice was practical, grounded in her own painful experience. She wasn't an advocate for war, but for purpose. She was guiding him to find his own strength, his own reason, and not to follow blindly in the footsteps of a woman he barely knew. He was quiet for a long moment, taking in her words. Then, he asked the final, most important question. "Was it worth it, Anya? All of it? The service, the pain, was it worth it?" Anya's gaze drifted to the silver star on the wall, to the photos of the faces of the fallen, and then to the young man in front of her. She thought about the endless desert, the cold nights, the ghosts. She thought about the quiet bar, the simple peace she had found, and the peace she was now protecting. A single, small tear traced a path down her cheek, but her voice was clear. "Every single day," she said, her voice filled with a profound and quiet certainty. It was worth it. The night had fallen, and the bar was finally quiet. The last of the patrons had gone home, their goodbyes filled with a warmth that had never existed before. The last stop was now a beacon of light on the dark highway, its windows glowing like a welcoming harbor. Anya was performing the same ritual she had done every night for 2 years, the same ritual she had been performing when the bikers had arrived. She was polishing the worn mahogany bar, her movements methodical and precise, her hands moving in small, practiced circles. But tonight, the task felt different. It was not a chore, it was an act of grace. It was a reclaiming of a simple life she had fought so hard to find. She walked behind the bar, her movements fluid and silent, and for a moment, her reflection caught her eye in the polished surface of a beer tap. She saw not the shy, unassuming waitress she had pretended to be. She saw not the hardened, scarred operative she had once been. She saw someone new, a woman with a confident bearing, with eyes that held both the profound sorrow of a warrior and the deep-set peace of a person who had finally found her home. She was whole. The trident was still there, but it no longer felt like a brand of a past she was running from. It was a badge of honor she had earned, and it was a part of her, a beautiful and powerful testament to her past. Anya poured herself a glass of water and looked out the window at the long, dark road. The ghosts she had run from were no longer chasing her. She had found a new kind of mission here, a new way to serve. Her internal voice, a whisper of a thought that felt as solid as a mountain, spoke the final words of her new creed. Still serving, still protecting, still faithful. She walked out from behind the bar and stood in the center of the room, her hands on her hips, her posture a quiet statement of strength. The bar was her post, the people her mission, the peace her purpose. She was no longer a ghost hiding in a dusty diner. She was a guardian, a sentinel in a sanctuary of her own making. The coffee pot was her weapon, the warm light her shield. She was home. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive stories.